Greetings, everybody. I'm Dr. Jenny Neville from Royal Holloway, University of London, and on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Megan Cavell from the University of Birmingham, I'd like to welcome you all to today's seminar. Sorry to those of you who've heard this before, but this event comes out of our AHRC project, which is entitled Group Identity and the Early Medieval Riddle Tradition. And you can find out more about that project on the website, which is entitled The Riddle Ages. And you'll find there, for example, recordings of last year's seminar series on early medieval identities, as well as recordings from this year's series, including this one, which will get put up later. And also watch that space for Riddle Quest, an escape room to be located at Sutton Hoo. For today, however, we are continuing our Riddles in Conversation series. The Exeter Book riddles were left frustratingly, or as I prefer to think, delightfully unsolved in their 10th century manuscript. And they're often enlisted to illustrate what we think we know about early medieval culture. But the truth is that they're much better at asking questions than giving answers. So in this seminar series, we're putting the Exeter Book riddles in conversation with different kinds of knowing. And today that knowing comes from ornithology in the person of Dr. Jim Reynolds. So Jim, if you want to put your slide up, please. Want to start sharing your screen? That's great.
How's that?
Perfect. Hope everyone else can see that too. Good. Okay, so Dr. Jim Reynolds has been at the Center of Ornithology at University of Birmingham since 2003. But before that, his academic route took him via Southampton, Toronto, Oxford, and Memphis. Now at the University of Birmingham, he teaches undergraduate and postgraduate students about birds to illustrate principles of animal ecology, animal behavior, population dynamics, and conservation biology. His research interests are broad, and they involve the study of birds of both marine and terrestrial environments. But he's also interested in how birds have been described in the scientific literature, a taxon that's deeply embedded in natural history writing. And as you can see on his slide that we have up here in front of us, his title today is Riddles in Conversation, or is it Conservation? Ornithological Insights. Can I have the next slide, please, Jim? And for those of us who would like to pursue the ideas from today a bit further, Jim's recommended some further reading for us, and that's T.R. Burkhead's Birds and Us, a 12,000-year history from cave art to conservation, which came out this year from Viking. So thank you so much, Jim, for bringing your expertise to this conversation. And what I want to do, just to get us started off, is to present the first of our medieval riddles. So if you want to move to the next slide, which is riddle 9. So I'll just read that aloud in Old English and then I'll hand over to you. Mech on visum dagum, deadna of yufum, father and mother. Ne was me fech thayen, eldor in inan. Tha mech an ongon, well hold meya wedum fetchan, held and frededa. Leil sheporach, swa arliche swa hira ayenbern. Of that itch under sheta, swa min ye shepo weren, unyisibum worth, eak and gasta. Mech sail frithamai, fedesidan. Of that itch awax, widder mechta sidas a setan. Heo have to swesra thulas, suna on doctra, thu heo swaduda. So that's the Old English. Do you want me to read the modern English translation too, Jim, or can I hand over to you now?
Yeah, go ahead and read the modern one as well, Jenny, please.
Sure. Okay. In these days, my father and mother gave me up for dead. There was no spirit in me yet, and no life within. Then someone began to cover me with clothing. A very loyal kinswoman protected and cherished me, and she wrapped me with a protective garment, just as generously as for her own children, until under that covering, in accordance with my nature, I was endowed with life amongst those unrelated to me. The protective lady then fed me until I grew up and could set out on wider journeys. She had fewer dear sons and daughters because she did so. So, Jim, the floor is yours.
First of all, I wanted to thank Jenny and Megan for inviting me along to talk about what I've loved for about the last 30 years of my academic life. And I chose this riddle to start with because I think as an ornithologist, you can't fail but be intrigued by these things that we call brood parasites. And the most likely candidate solution for this riddle is probably a brood parasite. However, since Jenny asked me to contribute to this seminar today, my nature is that I'm quite skeptical. And so I've been not playing devil's advocate, but I've been thinking about alternative solutions than the ones which are probably popularly accepted. I think for this one, I think the common cuckoo is actually a pretty good solution. It's intriguing, as I say, as a field ornithologist, because this strategy, this breeding strategy, is perhaps one of the things that turns ornithologists onto the discipline. And I thought I've got a series of slides showing a few bullet points describing the biology of each of these candidate species, but also I've tried to put imagery in there as well, because the imagery itself tells a story. And this is how I teach undergraduate and graduate students of ornithology to observe. That's one of my big things as a biologist, is observing all the time is the really key to us understanding natural systems. So the observation here is for something which is this cuckoo chick, which is typical of a brood parasite chick, is underdeveloped. As you can see, it's naked, it doesn't have any feathers. But what it does, and it's probably blind at this point as well, but what it does have is the motor skills to be able to push the host's eggs out of the nest. So backing off this a little bit, brood parasites typically are depositing their eggs. They lay on a daily basis, most bird species. They lay one egg per day. And what they do is they choose host species to lay their egg in, in their nests. So this was probably, looking at it, it's probably a reed warbler nest. You can see the nest has been built in reeds, so it's typically a reed warbler. But there are 108 different host species of cuckoos around the world. And what happens is that the egg is laid to time with the development of the host clutch. So the cuckoo chick hatches before the host eggs hatch. And then what happens is that maybe this cuckoo chick in this is probably only 2 or maybe 3 days old, and it has the motor skills to be able to push the whole of the host clutch out of the nest. Now, the interesting thing is, from a biological point of view, is the host parents don't abandon their nest. What they do instead is that they bring up junior here, even though junior is not their species. In fact, it's not their genetic offspring, but they still bring it up. And where brood parasites have become established, they have become highly effective at this kind of strategy. So what they do is that they choose hosts based upon acceptance of their egg being laid in the host nest. Now, this is a whole subdiscipline in biology. These host species sets are called gens, that's G-E-N-S. So the gens is the host species of a cuckoo. The plural of gens is gentes. So we know that common cuckoos will parasitize any number of host species here in the UK, probably between, I don't know, 10 or 20 host species they'll choose. But the key to the success is that they time their breeding strategy to evade detection, if you like. And the final point about this is, and I could talk for hours about these things, as my students will tell you, the final thing I wanted to bring to your attention is this thing about co-evolutionary arms races. Now, this sounds like sort of, almost a war study type language, but in a sense, the brood parasite and the host species are at war with each other. And what happens is that for every strategy that the cuckoo or other host brood parasite develops, the host species develop counter strategies. And so it becomes an arms race where there's constantly differences in things like egg pigmentation. So this is an unknown story in biology generally, in ornithology generally, is why are eggs spotted by many different species? And one of the theories is that maybe is to evade brood parasitism from honey guides or cuckoos or cowbirds in the New World. Maybe the eggshell pigmentation patterns allow hosts to recognize their own eggs and reject those of brood parasites. But it's a really interesting counter strategy, co-evolutionary arms race going on between these. And so what I did was I just picked out a few things in highlight here in the original modern English riddle that intrigued me, in fact, puzzled me sometimes. It's quite clear that we didn't really understand the strategies of brood parasites in any kind of detail until probably about 100 years ago, no longer than that. Even Aristotle all those years ago was aware of what was going on, but couldn't quite understand how cuckoos were successful and other brood parasites. There was a lot of speculation for centuries about what happened to the original eggs and chicks of the host species. And it's only through this careful observation in the early 1900s that we began to understand what these strategies were and how these brood parasites were becoming so successful. But on the flip side of that, what intrigues me as a reproductive biologist is cuckoos, however highly successful that they are investing a heck of a lot in egg production which don't hatch. So we don't really know how many cuckoo eggs are laid a year, but it's probably far more than cuckoo chicks that actually develop in nests, because their strategy is detected and it's evaded on a number of different occasions. So I think it's the last bit. So she had fewer dear sons and daughters because she did so. We don't know. That was the thing that really intrigued me, was we don't know whether host parents are sequentially serial hosts of parasitic events. One would think, working as I do on reproductive biology of birds, that actually birds learn from their mistakes. And so maybe host species, host birds are only parasitized once or twice in their lives before they learn that actually cuckoos are prevalent. They stand a chance of being parasitized, and they produce counter strategies to it themselves in their own lifetimes. But I think this is perhaps, of all the riddles that Jenny sent to me, I think this is perhaps the most intriguing of all of them, because so much has been written about cuckoos and brood parasites generally. And I think I'll leave it at that, because I don't want to get sort of embedded in the biology of brood parasitism, because I could be here till 8 o'clock tonight. I'm sure you'll understand. Shall I stop sharing so we can have a few questions if there are any?
Sure. While people are formulating questions, feel free to put them in the chat or put your hand up, folks, if you want to ask live. I'll just say how struck I was by all this language. I'm fascinated by scientific language, but by this language of kind of the arms race, of host parents. This is all language that is really relevant to the military context of Old English poetry, obviously working at a massive chronological gap. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Jim, or do you want to? Oh, we've got Craig. Do you want to unmute and ask?
So I'm curious about this. Presumably the cuckoo lays only one egg in one nest. Is that right?
Yes.
So what does that mean about the development of that bird? Because normally a nest is full of eggs. And I know I've seen, in my lawn, when the birds hatch, they're often travel together as a family for a while and learn things. But the cuckoo is by itself. So does it learn in a different way? So it's only a single child event for the parents.
That's right, it is. stepping back from it a little bit, and this is where I didn't want to get into detail, but I can certainly tell you a little bit about this. One of the keys to success for brood parasites is that they are very observant of host nests. So they know when that host female has started to lay. So what they don't do is they don't wait for the first egg to be laid and then go in there and then lay their own egg. They wait till at least 2 or 3 eggs in a multi-egged clutch are laid. Then they are reducing the chances of detection if they lay their egg and surrounded by 2 or 3 others. But you're entirely right. I always call young birds junior. Junior is going to be brought up on its own, and in a sense, it's being fed, it's monopolizing the parental provisioning effort. Now, this is where the extent of my brood parasitic knowledge disappears, because I don't know about how cuckoo fledglings develop the life skills you're talking about. That's interesting, and that in itself is something that I'd have to turn to my colleague at Cambridge, Nick Davis, to ask. He's the guy who's written a lot of stuff about brood parasites in the old world here, and he would know the answers to your questions. I have to say that's at the limit of my knowledge about brood parasite chicks. Sorry about that.
Right, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, which I will read out. Does this render cuckoo chicks, is this chicks, clocks? Does this render cuckoo chicks apt since they can clearly count? So are these, yeah, what can we say about these birds and counting?
We don't know whether birds can count at all. That's the interesting thing. Much has been written about this, because if you could count as a bird, you'd never be brood parasitized. Because if you knew how many eggs that you had in your clutch, you could count the number before you disappeared, and then the following day you could sit on them and start incubating them, and you could hatch your brood. I think this is why, from an egg pigmentation point of view, the spotting and coloration matching is attractive, because we don't know whether birds can count or not. I shouldn't say all birds, because we know that parrots can count. You can teach them to count. But whether they actually understand that they're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of 5 objects is another thing. I don't know. But actually, the whole color matching idea and egg coloration generally would allow you to go, well, hang on a minute, this egg is slightly differently colored. But the intriguing thing about sensory systems of birds is that it doesn't seem to matter that the cuckoo egg is slightly bigger than the host eggs. It's almost as if, in animal behavior terms, it's a super stimulus. If you match your egg to the coloration and the spotting pattern closely enough to the host clutch, the host parents don't seem to mind that egg that they're going to bring up as a cuckoo chick is slightly bigger. It's almost like it's bigger, so it's actually more investable. So we're going to invest much more in this breeding unit, if you like. So that's actually a really interesting question. I'm sort of dodging it slightly because we don't know whether birds can count. Sorry.
Maybe they can count 1, 2, and then more.
Well, maybe, yes.
Another question in the chat. Does the cuckoo chick practice siblicide? That is, does it aggressively kill any other chicks that may hatch in order to be the sole chick? Or I guess, is it always pushing the eggs out before we reach that point?
Now, somebody's been reading about brood parasitism here, because the common cuckoo chick doesn't kill its nest hosts or nest brethren, shall we call them. But there's a series of brood parasites in Africa called the honey guides, and the honey guides do kill chicks in the nest. And for years, people couldn't understand why honey guide chicks had specialist beak or bill accoutrements. They have barbs down the side of their bills. So what they do is they wait for the host chicks to hatch, and then they kill them. They lacerate them by pecking repeatedly at the host chicks, and they bleed to death. And the host chicks are then removed by the host as dead chicks, and then the honey guide chick is brought up on its own. And again, this is there seems to be a specialism here in University of Cambridge, not Nick Davis this time, but people called Becky Kilner and Claire Spottiswoode. They are two academics at Cambridge, and they work on these honey guides about brood parasitism, but they're more interested in the relationship between honey guides and African peoples. Honey guides, the clue's in the name, honey guides guide non-human animals, but also humans, to honey nests where they smoke out the bees. The tribesmen harvest the honey, and a reward for the honey guide is they give a little bit of beeswax to the honey guide, and the honey guide has developed this mutualistic relationship with humans, and that's what Claire's line of business is all about. She's really interested in the human-bird interactions. So I can go off on big tangents if you like, but I won't. I'll try and stick to these riddles. But that's a really interesting question, and read about honey guides if you want to hear more about it.
There are a few more questions in the chat. I'm conscious that we have quite a few more riddles that we want to get through. How many questions should we take? Jenny or Jim, do you have views on this?
I'll answer the easy ones. The more difficult ones might be.
Good idea. The first one is, sorry, go ahead.
Maybe do one or two more, yeah?
Well, I'll read out the next two because they're both more about the riddles, so we can maybe you could just address those quickly, Jenny, and then I'll read out the third, which is more of a comment anyways. So if the speaker of the riddle is a cuckoo, why is there a contradiction between the loyal kinswoman and the alien family? So what's going on there with point of view? Jenny, do you have a view on that? Or Jim?
Yeah.
Well, a short view?
Short view, no, I'll go on. But Jim, did you want to answer that question, or I can jump in about the text if you like?
I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Jenny, and then I can jump in.
Yeah. I don't know if there is a contradiction. So the idea is that there's a cuckoo, and a cuckoo's one species, and he's being raised by another species. So they are, the mother bird is a kinswoman because they're both birds, right? So in that sense, they're both kinswomen, but they're not actual sort of, not, I guess nuclear family is not the right thing, but they're not actually mom and dad and baby bird. They're not a family. So that's what I think that is. And the word loyal is a really interesting addition to that, because it makes it personal and value laden. What the mother bird is doing is what a mother bird should do, and what mothers should do for families, which is serve them loyally and give sacrifice, give food and everything and care. That's the right relationship. But the entity that she's doing it to is an alien person. And that's where the drama comes from. I don't think that contradicts the biology at all, but that's where I think the human side of it comes in.
Yeah, can I just add something to that? I think it's I've always been fascinated by the disparaging terms that cuckoos sort of invoke in us. They don't in me. I should also raise the flag and say I love corvids, and a lot of people do not like corvids at all. That's the crows, the ravens, magpies, jackdaws, rooks. A lot of people are very disparaging about that whole group of birds, partly because I've got a PhD student just writing his thesis up about corvids, but I don't like the way certain groups of birds are hijacked, and there's sort of almost bad feeling around cuckoos, for instance, because I think I'm right in saying that in some European languages, derivations of the word cuckoo mean cowardice and almost disloyalty. And of course, cuckoldry is not a positive term if you're in a monogamous relationship. It's those sorts of things. I'm intrigued by the cowardice connotation. It's a very effective biological strategy, and I don't understand why that's taken so negatively. This is not just in one or two European countries. It's actually throughout Europe. The cuckoo is not thought of as a very, let's say, exemplar avian species.
There's a sense of it's the not fair play and sort of righteous human indignation, which in this poem is, it's playing with the foster system, and it's playing with this idea of a kind of someone coming into your home and into your family and infiltrating, which is, I think, really interesting. Another question from the chat, and then I think we'll need to move on, is when it's saying about the mother, that the mother gave them up for dead, is this the host's eggs? I think there's an interesting ambiguity here.
I don't know if I can jump in here too, but I'm also reluctant to do so because, of course, the man in the room who's written the article about this is Dieter Bitterli. I don't know, Dieter, if you want to jump in here. This is about, I'm happy to summarize you if you don't want to, that's fine too.
No, I thank you for inviting me. I was just about typing my answer into the chat, but the idea here is that the bird is born twice, as it were. This was the belief. That goes back to Isidore and probably Pliny as well. So eggs and birds laying eggs were seen as giving birth to their young twice, as it were. And let's put it this way: the bird hatches and is born a second time. It's born for the first time when the egg is laid. So that's from Isidore. Isidore tells us, perhaps I can quickly quote, there's the passage here. All birds, he says, all kinds of birds are born twice. But first the eggs are laid, then they are formed and given life by the heat of the mother's body. And that's why the bird at the beginning is given up dead. I wouldn't necessarily translate given up for dead, but dead. He's the dead one. He's given up. The dead one is given up. So basically, the abandonment of the biological parents, and that's all that needs to be said here. So I don't see a contradiction.
Yeah. So it's the idea is that the egg seems dead. So
Yeah.
the parents leave the egg, the cuckoo egg, as if it was dead. So the egg is dead. And then it's born a second time. Thank you, Dieter, thanks. I don't know what you think about that, Jim. That's what people used to think about eggs.
Yeah, and I think there's a really, I mean, I've never even thought about it like that. And I've been working on these things for 30 years. I think it's because obviously birds are not viviparous, so they're not, they don't have young developing inside them. And in a sense, I've never thought of an egg as being dead though. I've always thought about an egg being a living thing, but the embryo is, in a sense, is in stasis if it's not being warmed through incubation. And it only starts developing through that process of incubation. So, but it's a really, this is why I love these sorts of things, because it's a completely different way of looking at things. And yeah, that's now going to intrigue me for the rest of the week, because I think about things being reborn, even though I tell my students, you know, they're not born, they hatch birds. But yeah, that's something I never even thought about. So thank you. That's a good insight.
Well, I'm not saying this is biologically correct, of course. It's the
No.
belief.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to make the executive decision that we should move on now. If you want to share your screen for the next riddle, I will just say everybody in the chat loves corvids too, so you're not alone in that, Jim.
Well, that's great. Yeah. So, do you want to read this one, Jenny?
Sure. No, I'm not muted. Excellent. So riddle 7, which I think of not as riddle 7, but as the traveling spirit riddle. My garment is silent when I tread on the earth, or when I inhabit a dwelling or disturb the water. Sometimes over the dwellings of men, my ornaments raise me up, along with this lofty wind, and then the strength of the clouds widely bears me over the people. My jewelry resounds loudly and makes music, clearly sings, when I am not touching either water or earth, and I am a traveling spirit.
Thank you. I felt when I was reading this riddle, you know, the more I sort of started to think about swans generally as being the focus of this riddle, the more I felt as a biologist detached from the content of the riddle. So I'll explain that in a bit, but I just wanted to just talk a little bit about swans. So one of the things I'm intrigued about is, it's going to sound odd, but monogamy in birds. For years, in fact, up until the 1960s, ornithologists thought that most bird species of the world, and by the way, current numbers of bird species in the world are about 10,800 species. I looked it up the other day. Up until the 1960s and early 70s, we thought most species of birds were monogamous. That is, one male, one female pairing and breeding, and there being what we call no extra pair young in the nest. In other words, no genetic contribution from any bird outside that pair bond. The watershed moment was when we developed molecular techniques to be able to sample birds, young chicks, and be able to work out who mum and dad are. And we can do that because birds have they have nucleated red blood cells. We don't. We don't have red blood cells as mammals. We don't have red blood cells which contain nuclear material, whereas birds do. And that's really handy for somebody like me as a field ornithologist, because we can go and blood sample by taking a tiny amount of blood from every chick in the nest. We can take blood from the pair male and female, and we can compare the DNA markers, if you like, of who mum and dad are. Are they basically the parents of all those chicks in the nest? And when the watershed moment was that we started to look and we realized that actually this strategy of monogamy, which we see in very few groups of birds, but swans are one group where they are faithful for life. The other classic bird, group of birds which we talk about, are the albatrosses. The albatrosses are beautiful, they are ethereal, they're very long-lived, they are true monogamists. Unless mum or dad dies, they don't repair, they pair for life. Okay, so mute swan, I think, is a really interesting example here. And I'm really intrigued, not just because I was asked to contribute to this series today, I'm really intrigued by the relationships between us as humans and birds. That's one of the things which, as well as sort of wearing many different hats as a conservation biologist and working on breeding strategies and all these and behavior, I'm also interested in that relationship between humans and birds. And I think swans are particularly intriguing. And this is where I find this riddle really intriguing, is because for centuries, we farmed swans like we farmed ducks and we farmed geese, and we ate them, okay? Because they're great sources of protein. So people were feasting on swans over the centuries. And I think that sort of speaks to this changing relationship now between us as humans and mute swans. So it's now illegal to eat swans. In fact, it's illegal to do anything with swans without the permission of Her Majesty, because she has control over all the mute swans in the UK. My PhD supervisor was Chris Perrins at Oxford. He was LVO, Lieutenant of the Victorian Order. He was responsible for rounding up all the swans in this famous thing called swan upping at Abbotsbury and other places. And the great thing about waterfowl is, as a field ornithologist, is you can round them up after they breed because they lose all their flight feathers. So you can run them down and you can herd them, you can catch them, you can ring them, you can mark them, and you can easily work on them. But the really interesting thing about mute swan is that of all the swans in the world, there's about 7 species or 9, something like that. They're the quietest, which I think probably is reflected in the riddle somewhat. They are the quietest, they're the least migratory, I think, of the UK swans. But their calling is really important. And if they fly anywhere, you see them in these skeins of geese and swans, and they call to each other in flight because they fly in these skeins and they're communicating in flight. So, but we don't tend to think of mute swans particularly as being very noisy, and that maybe is reflected in the content of this riddle. So picking the bones out of the riddle, I'm interested in what others might say, particularly Jenny, but others here in attendance, about some of the language of this riddle, because I think it maybe reflects changes somewhat in human attitude towards this species particularly, or this group of species. And clearly we know swans have been the subject of music and dance in culture around the world. And I think there is something, as I said, about albatrosses. I think there's something about swans, you know, this whole idea about the swan song. If you shoot a swan, it goes into this melodious sort of swan song before it dies. That I think creates this language, like at the end of the riddle, traveling spirit. I think there's something almost magical about swans, and I think people do feel very fondly about them. I'd be interested to hear the thoughts of other people about this riddle. I'll stop sharing.
While folks are getting their questions together, I feel like I need to confess and apologize for mangling the great cuckoo clocks joke, which I misread as chicks, and the question about counting was much funnier than I made it out to be. So sorry, anybody who's listening to this as a recording won't get to see the chat, so let's just pretend I did nothing wrong. A comment in the chat from Leslie about a contemporary case for monogamy in peregrine falcons. If anybody wants to check that out, there's a rare documented event underway. Do you have any knowledge of peregrines, Jim?
Only that where I'm speaking to you all from today is Pershore in Worcestershire, where we have a pair of peregrines on the Abbey Tower. Pershore Abbey is quite a famous building here in Worcestershire. The peregrines, I said when they arrived, they were a young pair of birds. And people were curious as to why I thought they were young, because of where they nested. They nested on a water spout on the top of the tower, and the first heavy rainfall we had washed their nest away and their eggs. So I think they learn from mistakes they make, peregrines do, like many long-lived birds of prey and other long-lived birds. I've never worked on peregrines, so I wouldn't know about their monogamy, but I think they are fairly faithful. We have them on the clock tower at the University of Birmingham. The peregrines nest there on one of the tallest clock towers on a university campus in Europe. I think they are fairly faithful as birds.
Great. Back to our swans. The question in the chat, was any part of the swan used by humans to make musical instruments? I don't know whether this might be more for you, Jenny, but
Not
feel
that
free
I know
to
of.
jump in.
Not that I know of. No, I think the whole thing about the riddle is the paradox is the expectation that the swan itself just doesn't make any noise. But I don't know if you've ever had a swan fly over your head, that although they're not necessarily making noise, that I've never heard them talk while they fly over my head, but the noise from their feathers, which is what the jewelry is the idea of feathers as ornamentation, feathers as clothing, and all through the riddle, the language is looking at feathers as wondrous things and being described using metaphors for clothing and jewelry and other kinds of ornamentation. So that's what it is. And the idea is that instead of the bird making noise with its mouth, it's this ornamentation that is responsible for the sound.
So a couple of comments on that. Of all birds of the world, for those of you not familiar with bird anatomy, most flighted, in fact, all flighted birds, their long bones are hollow. And this is a strategy for flight performance, because you don't want solid cortical bone in your medulla of your bone because you're carrying too much weight. So for every sort of stage of the year, apart from breeding when you're producing eggs as a female, you have hollow bones, and they are structurally as strong as solid bones. You know, a solid tube is just as strong structurally. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if people in the past have taken long bones of things like swans and geese, and because they're hollow, you could probably make some piccolo or something out of them. I don't know. The other thing which is interesting about feathers, feathers have always fascinated me as an ornithologist. There's a species when I worked in Florida, there's a species called the common nighthawk, which is a nightjar. And the common nighthawk, the males fly to about 100 feet in the air, and then they rush headlong to the ground with their wings outstretched, and they cause this sort of buzzing sound, which is a signal to the females to signal quality. And so it's not quite musical, it's a bit raucous, but it took me days and days and days when I started field work in Florida to work out where this noise was coming from, till I noticed these birds were doing this. So actually feathers and wind passing through feathers, I understand could be viewed as sort of lovely musical signals.
I wonder if there's also a play on the use of feathers as quills and the idea of singing out as writing, but maybe not. I don't know that they were going around picking up swan feathers in particular. Jenny, you've already covered the what is their jewelry question, and there's another comment about their feathers whistling, so that kind of goes with everything that we've been saying. And another comment in the chat, the point and the irony of the poem is that the mute swan does not sing, so that's what it's playing with, this idea of muteness. One other comment in the chat or question, weren't sparrows a byword for lechery? I believe Chaucer and Shakespeare mentioned this.
That's a really interesting comment. I was in Spain last week, and I was jealous of the amount of sparrows that I saw all over the south of Spain. I was around Granada. And the only thing I would say about sparrows is I can't say anything about lechery. I've never heard that before. But actually, from a biologist perspective, we are really concerned about house sparrows in this country. They're a conservation massive concern because their numbers have dropped through the floor, and we don't really know why. And again, you know, like I was saying earlier about corvids and potentially cuckoos, I think for years we took sparrows for granted, house sparrows. And the lesson I teach conservation biologists at Birmingham is we should count the common things as well as the rare things, because if we don't count the common things and they suddenly become less common, we don't actually know what's going on and what's caused the decline. And so I'm not going to bang on the drum too much here, but I give a lot of public lectures about cherishing the common things as well as the rare things. And I think that's really important for house sparrows.
Yes, no banging on the drum, but whistling on flutes perhaps. There are a few links, good segue to flutes in the chat if anyone wants to follow up. There's a link to the National Geographic, an article about bone flute. I think we should move on now to our next riddle. So do you want to share screen again, Jim?
Sure. Right. Jenny.
Am I back? Yes. Okay. So riddle 10. My nose was in a narrow place, and I was beneath water, had gone beneath the flood, totally sunk in mountainous streams, and I grew up in the sea, covered by waves above me, touching a sailing wood with my body. I had a living spirit when I came out of the embraces of sea and tree in a black garment. Some of my trappings were white when the air lifted me up alive, the wind from the wave, then bore me widely over the seal's bath. Say what I am called.
So I think this riddle is one of the easier ones, and I think barnacle goose is probably the answer to this, and that's because I think there's a pure resemblance between this goose barnacle, or actually some people call it the gooseneck barnacle, and when you look at its anatomy, it looks like you know, this neck and head of the barnacle goose. So I think this has been something which has been in the ornithological and allied literature for a long, long time. On from the biological point of view, I think there are migrant species, we know barnacle geese are, they nest in places like Iceland, but also in really remote places like Svalbard up north of Norway. And we know that they overwinter here. So they come down in vast numbers. So I put here Calaverock, which is a Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust Centre in southwest Scotland, I think. Anyway, it's in southern Scotland. And I had colleagues many years ago who worked on barnacle geese because of their migratory physiology. They could catch them in Calaverock. They put heart rate monitors surgically inside them in the field, and they tracked their energetics in flight. And I think they are a relatively understudied species of goose, actually. I'd be intrigued to know whether people used to eat them a lot. I'm thinking if they were probably overwintering somewhere like Calaverock in Scotland, they probably were caught in some numbers. And people like goose, I'm sure they like to eat it. But I don't know how much that's eroded the population of UK overwintering barnacle geese. But I think this is a relatively straightforward riddle to solve. So I think much of this refers to, much of the riddle which I've highlighted refers to the anatomical resemblance between this barnacle and as I say, the neck and the head of the goose. It's aquatic or even marine in terms of that's where barnacles live. And we know that barnacles develop on wooden substrate, so they will stick to wooden substrate. So I think it all sort of falls into place, and I don't have any doubts that actually barnacle goose is the solution to this. So I'll stop sharing.
Grand. There is one question in the chat, which I think might be more of a question for Jenny, but feel free to take it to Jim. These riddles seem to reflect observation of various birds and their behaviors. Who would have traveled and brought the information back to the person devising the poem or riddle?
I'm glad that's an interesting question, because that's what's continuously I keep coming back to. Is I was thinking about the timing of this Exeter Book of Riddles and the sources, that we're drawing from. And I'm intrigued as to when the people who wrote these riddles would have seen some of these species.
Well, we do know that they're drawing on natural history texts from the classical world. We've got Pliny the Elder popping up all over the place. Who specifically would have traveled? Do we want to do the full riddle tradition? This would be a nice segue into our Latin content. We know that I don't want to just answer all the questions, but I'm gonna. We know that our Latin riddler Aldhelm has sort of sparked the interest in the early medieval period in riddles, was drawing heavily off the North African poet Symphosius's riddle collection. So we know that there's information traveling from North Africa to England, that there's religious institutions and schools that are entirely run by prominent North African, Mediterranean, obviously, clerics. So there are books moving, and the classical world is coming to England, and people are drawing on that material. But the extent to which observation is also coming into play is something that scholars like to argue about. Probably we've got a blend of authoritative tradition and observation of local species, and sometimes those two things are really complicated and hard to pick out which one's the correct answer, if there is a correct answer.
And for this particular one, I was sort of laughing to myself when Jim was saying, it's like, oh, this is an easy one. Well, it wasn't for us, Old English scholars, for a long, long time. It was a real breakthrough when someone finally made the connection with the barnacle goose story. Because, I mean, again, Dieter bitterly knows this better than I do, that the barnacle goose thing gets written about later, maybe early modern. And this riddle is the earliest, I believe, the earliest expression of that story. So there is no source for it before this one. Please interrupt me, Dieter, if I'm making a terrible mistake here, but that's my understanding of it, is that, thank you.
It only occurs in Petrus Damiani and Gerald of Wales, interestingly. So it's late medieval or medieval, early medieval. True.
So that just brings that question back again about observation, right? We don't have any textual tradition before this one. This is the first time it gets written down, and the stuff that comes later doesn't obviously link up to the Old English riddle. Somebody else has rediscovered it. So the person, the riddler writing this riddle is drawing on some other source of knowledge, as far as we know, which I think about Bede working out how tides work. And that's what I think about the barnacle goose story, is that people maybe in the north of England were asking the question, where do all these geese come from?
And then it
came up with
becomes,
this,
it becomes an important image in the medieval bestiary tradition, and we get lots of fascinating images of barnacle geese hanging from trees and things like that. There's another comment in the chat. Did you want to respond to that, Jim?
Well, what I was going to say, I think it's intriguing about the comments about the north of England, because one of the things I also work on is feeding of birds. And one of the things which I think is really interesting is that the earliest case of feeding of birds in the UK was probably St Cuthbert feeding eider ducks in Northumberland, in Holy Island. And that must have been at a, I'm not a historian, but it must have been at a similar time to the Exeter Book of Riddles. Am I right in saying that or not? Jenny, do you know? You're muted.
sorry, I don't do dates. Go in, Megan.
I mean, it's within several hundred years, but we normally just conflate the entire early medieval period. So I think it's still a fair comparison.
Okay, but I thought it was interesting with St Cuthbert that it happened to be eider ducks, but it seems to me there's some really interesting early observations of particularly waterfowl, and that's quite interesting because ducks and geese are obviously waterfowl. But the thing that also intrigued me is that when I've been doing a little bit of reading the last few weeks in readiness for this around sources, looking at the relationships between people and birds, and barnacle geese are not really mentioned in any of the ornithological texts that I'm reading. So that's interesting. So I'm hoping we can save the chat, because I know Dieter's just put a really interesting source in there. I just saw it flash up on my screen. I'd be keen to read a bit more about this. So
yes, I'll definitely save the chat for you.
Brilliant.
Jim, there was another comment in the chat about eating barnacle geese, apparently weren't considered flesh, so they're good during Lent or on Fridays, I guess. And then there was another question in the chat about your slide, Jim, with the pictures. And John said, when I look at your bivalve in your illustration, it isn't obvious to me that that looks like a barnacle goose. What am I missing?
Well, yeah, and I struggle to find a decent picture to show it. Yeah, I will have to dig around and try and find a better picture, which I'll pass on for further reference. But I've seen it drawn. I just was trying to find a photograph, and there's not many people who are aficionados of gooseneck barnacles who are taking lovely pictures of them. But I'm convinced that there is a resemblance. I'll just try and find it a better picture to show it.
Everybody's homework is to go and Google this later.
That's right. We're all good on the barnacle quest.
Ooh, that's a brilliant name. Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Do we want to do one more riddle in that time, or do we want to have a sort of general discussion?
I wanted to just raise one, if that's okay, which I'm disagreeing with. I'll skip the longest riddle that Jenny sent to me because I think it's too long. This one. So this one about venom and snakes. Do you want to read this, Jenny? Because I'm not convinced by the solution to this one.
Okay. I have a gleaming white appearance and also one that grows darkly black, as I am made of the various hues of the feather. I lack a warbling voice, for I produce a rattling sound with my beak. Although in my ferocity I tear scaly snakes to pieces, my body does not swell up with the deadly venom. I am even in the habit of feeding my tender chicks and offspring with the poisonous flesh and foul blood of serpents. I can't remember whose translation this was. Doesn't sound like me. I may have stolen that from somebody else.
Okay, but I think I'm right in saying that the suggested solution from academics was stork. I'm assuming that was white stork, which is the white stork we see nesting on chimneys throughout sort of much of Europe. I can't work out, I'm just going on to the, so I can't work out, apart from the gleaming white appearance, I don't get white stalk as a solution to this at all, because I've been doing some searching in the literature and I can't see any of the ornithological references about storks, white storks, storks generally, being sort of concentrated predators of snakes. And this seemed to heavily suggest to me that snake was a major dietary constituent for this, you know, candidate, the solution to this riddle, if we want to call it that. And so I was sort of scratching around trying to work out, well, what are the species we could be thinking about? And this sort of relates to what was said 5 minutes ago about where these riddles would have been based on, from who as authorities would have provided some of these observations. And one of the things which we know is a potential species, and I've got another two actually, which I haven't got slides for, but secretary bird is a species of Africa, which I think is known as a snake killer. Its whole anatomy is sort of adapted for killing particularly venomous snakes, but also non-venomous snakes. Snakes can be quite difficult to capture and to feed on, but we know that they have really forceful lower legs and sort of, you know, kick strength. And secretary birds, I couldn't find a decent video when I was looking for one, of course. This is the joys of YouTube. But we know they will take snakes a lot. But again, even in the scientific literature, I couldn't find anything about them feeding venomous or non-venomous snakes to their young. But subsequently, while in southern Spain, I was talking to the guys I was working with in Spain, and they both came up with the same species together, independently, but in one voice. They said short-toed eagle. Because short-toed eagle apparently has a reputation as a killer of venomous and non-venomous snakes in Spain, but also in the rest of Western Europe. And the other one I came across this morning as I was scratching around looking at snake-killing birds was the roadrunner, as well as Western United States. Roadrunners are known to kill snakes a lot. They'll even take on rattlesnakes and kill them. But I don't know whether even they feed rattlesnake to their chicks. So I'm getting away from storks and much more to these birds of prey. But, you know, that's just my opinion. I may be wrong. But again, I'd be interested to know what thoughts were for anybody who's got passing interest in snake-killing birds.
I love that this is the exact room where that is likely to be somebody's niche interest. I am conscious of time, and I'm afraid we're going to have to end in a minute since I need to exit this Zoom meeting and go to another one. I'm going to save the chat. I wonder if now we'll maybe stop the recording. We'll thank Jim. We'll stop the recording, and then I can sort of leave you to continue chatting, but we'll have officially closed. So perhaps before I stop recording, we could all just either turn on our screens or put a little reaction in the bottom corner and just thank Jim properly for such a fascinating conversation.